Dom, it's a great time to be a journalist in America, isn't it?
Yeah.
I
I have I've got nothing clever to say as opposed to like last week with my hostile government takeover. I don't know what to say
because the song still holds, except it's kind of not funny, and
because it's still going on.
I know, I know. Oh God, I guess we'll start the show. I wanted to be happier, but I'm just like, no. But we do have some really important stuff to cover.
We do.
There
We
we
do.
go. Let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
Breaking unemployment records.
exactly just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee,
And maybe a few drinks.
we realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists
Are taking a critical look at American media.
As DEI initiatives continue to be dismantled and a broad swath of the country's demographics will be affected, especially LGBTQ plus individuals whose very existence has drawn ire and erasure. Dom and I couldn't think of anyone better to discuss some of these headlines than Cathy Renna, communications director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. Now, we've known Cathy and worked with her for years as she is a strong and fearless voice on stories that impact the queer community. Cathy is also the owner of Target Q LLC, and welcome to our show, Cathy.
Hi, good to see you both.
And so
It
Absolutely.
has been a
It's
while. I've seen you, Jenna, but I haven't seen you, Dominic, in a long time.
I I know it's been forever, too long.
all right. Well, Dom, do you want to take
Yeah,
our first
I'm going to
headline,
start with the
which,
first headline.
ugh,
So, first headline that we're talking about is from the LGBTQ plus news source, The Advocate, which reported recently that the National Park Service quietly removed the word transgender from the Stonewall National Monument's website. So now the Trump administration also took down pages on HIV and queer health from federal sites. No announcement, no explanation. The information just gone. NBC News followed up that multiple federal agencies have been scrubbing related content. The State Department removed information for LGBTQ plus travelers, while the Department of Education took down guidance on protecting transgender students. So, Kathy, we're kind of looking here. If history is being erased from, you know, government sites, how much responsibility does the media have in preserving it in public consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that, we went through this the first administration as well, right? I mean, everything
mhm.
LGBT was wiped from the White House site. So it's not like we're shocked or surprised. And frankly, they may have tried to do it quietly, but we weren't quiet about it. So, we knew it would happen. And so when it did, it was absolutely vital for folks to be visible, organized. I mean, within like 12 hours, we had over 1,000 people in front of the Stonewall Inn in the park across the street, which is the actual national park site for the Stonewall Monument. And we had a ton of media there. I mean, we made sure the media came and covered. Look, it's really all our responsibilities, but I think the media has a special responsibility because it is really through media that so many people have that greater understanding of our history. It's not new that it's being erased, even more than it has been in the past. I mean, the fact is we're fighting curriculum battles, we're fighting visibility battles, on all levels, not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well. So, helping the media understand just how powerful and meaningful this is. I mean, talking about these executive orders and the very serious pieces of legislation that are coming down the pike, or other kind of statements and edicts that are coming out of the new administration. It's interesting how this history piece is really hitting people, and the erasure piece is really landing on folks in the queer community and as well as our allies, because it does feel like exactly what you're saying. And so advocating for media to kind of keep telling our stories and doing it through the fact that this is happening has been, I feel like that is one part that we're doing a little bit better on than most, right?
That's a big positive because you don't always get to say that.
No, I don't. And I think it's because it's very symbolic. It's very emotional. It's very like visceral. When something bad happens, we go to the Stonewall Inn. When something good happens, we go to the Stonewall Inn. And so does the media. Like they just show up. They know that for the queer community, that is like sacred ground, essentially, And so in that way, I feel like that piece is getting a decent amount of attention, and we're advocating. So that's helping as well. I think there are other places where there's not as much attention being paid on the impact on queer communities. And that's where we're putting our efforts, redoubling our efforts, really.
Well, when it comes to, I guess, attacks on the community, for example, the national board president of the National Lesbian, Gay, and Gay Journalists Association, or NLGJA, posted a message calling out the latest attacks on LGBTQ plus community, especially trans and non-binary folk, saying that as journalists, we're not only a source of information for the general public, but also a vital space where LGBTQ plus people can find representation, connection, and truth. So I have a two-part question for you. So first and foremost, in addition to when we talk about this erasure, there also seems to be an effort to control the language that we use now, especially in the media. And is that something that is ubiquitous across the country, or are there, from your perspective, are there areas of the country where literally even the language that people use to describe themselves, to call themselves, is being erased, and what does that mean for how the media then tells their story?
Yeah, no, it's really important. I think the first part I'll say, I'm very supportive and aligned with the LGBTQ plus Journalists Association, worked with them for decades, and they're right. And the approach is to be not just a source but a resource, because now more than ever we need to be doing the education piece. I mean, this is, I used to always joke with my mom about, she's like, why don't you go do PR and, make a lot more money, basically. And, because this is not just about PR. This is about media education, about helping journalists. There are reasons that folks don't, this all ties in with what you said, Dominic. There are reasons that journalists don't know a lot about the community because we're not taught about our community, any of us, in schools, in culture. So as that has increased, it's gotten somewhat better. But the reality is that we as advocates, as community members, need to be willing to go that extra mile with journalists and say what you're asking in the second part of the question, which is, this is how you talk about pronoun uses. This is how you describe, diverse individuals in our community. This is how you address how these issues impact on folks. This is how you frame all of the attacks that are coming against us and what is motivating people and what people can do about it. Going that extra mile is more important than ever. Some of us have been doing it for a very long time. I would say progress is not linear. We will take some steps forward and then we might take a step back. We've seen the pendulum swing, back and forth, but I think that I said this at the rally in front of the Stonewall Inn, and I think it took people back a tiny bit. But I said, in some ways, we have to also look at how these attacks can also present us with an opportunity to tell the stories of trans and non-binary folks. Because the reality is very, very, very few people say they know someone who's trans or non-binary. It's almost impossible to find someone who says they don't know someone who's gay or lesbian or bisexual, because we've done the work around that part of our community. So getting these stories out there and helping the media tell those stories well and in a in a nuanced, accurate, inclusive way is something that we need to really focus our energies on right now because we do have the spotlight in some ways. It doesn't always feel great, but like we still need to take advantage and use that as an opportunity to educate folks.
Dom, do you mind if I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so here's what, as I'm listening to what you're saying, Cathy, it's also making me wonder though, when it comes to the trans community specifically, that was very much a source of contention, let's say, during the election. And when journalists covered, or talked about what were some of the top issues or the way that the election was being handled, that didn't really seem to come to the forefront, even though after the fact, there were a lot of conversations saying, well, the Democratic Party put trans people too much in the forefront. And I remember as a journalist saying, no, they didn't. The Republican Party ran a bunch of anti-trans ads and sort of tried to back the Democratic Party into a position of defending. And again, what we're talking about is 1% or less than 1%, if I'm not mistaken, of the country's population. Um, I guess, yeah, like, was that a miss on our part as journalists?
Yeah, I think that that's right. The context and the nuance of all that. I mean, I remember literally the morning after the election, you had folks on Morning Joe kind of saying it was trans people's fault that we lost the election. Basically, that was the message. And all of us were like, what? I mean, I was at the DNC. We wanted actually more, but there was some trans representation. There was certainly inclusion. There was not a sort of a proactive response to the attacks. I think that's the thing that created some tension, not just across parties and voting communities and voting blocks, but also made it harder for the media to do a decent job because they oversimplified it, which, I mean, the media oversimplifies lots of things, right? But it was oversimplified. Talking about how our trans and non-binary siblings were used as a wedge issue and a scare tactic and I would say boogeyman, but like boogie person maybe, like as a way to really divide folks and distract because that's what they do best. They try and overwhelm and distract folks and prey to their fears. And when I say we, the Democratic Party did not respond in a way. The task force actually worked with the Transgender Law Center on a response ad to the attack ads, but we didn't have millions of dollars. We had thousands of dollars, and we did what we could, and it was a really powerful ad, but it wasn't counteracted enough, and because of that, that was kind of allowed to thrive in media, and we all pushed back, but it was pretty. You're right, Jen. It was pretty overwhelming as a theme of the Monday morning quarterbacking that always happens right after. Was very knee jerk and was very damaging because it sets our trans and non-binary siblings are like they've been living in fear now for a long time, and these attacks and sort of the targeting of the trans community has become like a priority wedge issue because it's effective. It's working.
So it's interesting, Cathy, because Jen and I have discussed this before too. I was very critical in terms of how the media dealt with Joe Biden earlier on, in the sense that I felt there were issues that Biden had that the media didn't call out sooner. That might have moved up whether
That
or
some
not we
people are
had
writing books about now.
exactly about and based about was he fit to be president, and the media kind of when those questions came up, people were just like, that's not the issue. He's fine. He's running the country. And that became conspiratorial. When we saw what we saw, someone who just didn't seem like he was in his best condition to run the country. But that being said, it's just so interesting to me that we now have the media that is more willing to jump in and jump on this train of blaming, the Democrats with trans people. And yet they weren't willing to kind of look at themselves and how they also might have jumbled up certain aspects of of reporting on the campaigns, like almost like it's again, this is a much it's much more divisive, and it's much easier to get a reaction because we do know half the country does respond to these kind of tactics. People listen to this. They listen when they hear, some people are, like you just said before, many people might not know transgenders or non-binary. So therefore, they are fearful. So does the media kind of have to look at itself a little bit here right now and see where the role that it also played in what we're dealing with right now?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. There's a, and there's a, I don't have to tell you to, right, or anybody listening to this, that the trend around the not just the corporate media, but but mostly the corporate media of really not putting the resources they need to, or frankly, following the ethics that they should be as journalists, or journalists with a capital J, as I like to say. I would hope, to really cover that, right? But like to really cover this stuff well. And I haven't been a Glad for a long time, but you can take the girl out of Glad, but you can't take the Glad out of the girl. Like they're not covering things in a fair, accurate, inclusive manner. That was my mission from the beginning times of doing this work. And it's because there's this constant, highly, financially motivated need. They got to be first, they got to be fast, they got to be quick, and then they move on to the next thing. And no one has any like memory of the, no one has really invested. One of the things that I think our community is really doing right now, and part of it's self-preservation, but part of it is because if you really want to get accurate information, you have to go to trusted sources. And unfortunately, it's exactly what you're saying. The Washington Post is not a trusted source for me anymore. I mean, you saw the announcement that Jeff Bezos made. The opinion page is going to focus on like personal liberty and the free market. Like, and anyone who's not writing good things about that is not going to be included. Like, that's devastating when we think about the history and the work that we've done to get folks at the Washington Post to where they were, or the New York Times for that matter. I mean, the New York Times has been a target around their, gross understatement, mixed coverage of trans and non-binary issues. And I think this is the media as an industry, right? The media as a business is a big part of the reason why we're seeing the lack of frankly good coverage and good work that we should be. And that's a problem. That's a problem. It's why we're focusing on community-based media, not these nonprofit models for media, folks like you, social media, podcasting.
I was going to ask about that, Cathy, how important that is right now, because if you see, you can't, legacy media, it's kind of like, it's always it's going to exist. But the reality is we're not going to get more space in that probably than we have. So therefore, what do we do in terms of how important are independent journalists, and also, and then all news influencers, how important are they now to the cause, these various types of media?
They're incredibly important. I mean, they're like, at this point, I feel like that's the front lines. And that's just gonna be the reality, I think, for a while. I mean, again, like I know that we see things happen in there are patterns, and then they'll come and then they'll go. Like, I talked to someone the other night here, one of our events, that was saying, oh, it'll be fine. It'll just be bad for a few years and then it'll get back to normal. And on some level, like, things do adjust in this country. This is what we've seen. We see Obama for 8 years and then we get Trump for 4 years. Like it's a little bit feels like a roller coaster. But I think for the queer community, the media plays such an important role in trying to minimize the damage that happens during 4 years of Trump, or now what will be another 4 years, hopefully just 4 years. The media plays such an important role in that, and losing faith, losing the reach of and the impact of legacy media is really damaging. At the same time, we have to be somewhat in survival mode. And so going to more, it's not an alternative media for me. It's more community focused media, more ethical media, more progressive media, LGBTQ queer media, and social media. I mean, young people, they're not reading the Washington Post, and they're not going to. They're going to TikTok. They're going to Instagram. They're following.
Oh, we're on TikTok.
Yeah, we're following organizations and folks that are not just. It's people say you're going to go to folks that are more aligned with how you think. That's not necessarily true. I think they're just going to places that they feel like the people are being authentic and they can trust.
Yeah, the authenticity is something that we've discussed and we've heard a lot from a lot of other people. I do want to go back to, though, as you critique the media and ask, let's see. I've been doing this for 20 years, a little bit over that.
Mhm.
And one of the early stories, Kathy, you know this, Dom, you both know this, but one of the early stories that I covered that left me shook, for lack of a better description,
Mhm.
was the Newark murder of Sakia Gunn. And the murder alone was just absolutely terrible. This was a 15-year-old kid who basically her last words were, "No thanks, I'm a lesbian." And someone felt the need to take her life. But more so was the lack of media response around it. That's what left me shook. And so now here we are, 20 plus years later, and we have seen a horrific story, the torture and murder of Sam Nordquist in Canandaigua, New York. And Sam is a trans man, but I guess, Kathy, my thing is, do you see? Because if I go looking for stories about Sam, at least I can find them. But if I casually engage in news coverage, it doesn't lead. In fact, I think when the news broke, it didn't even lead.
Yeah, I mean, you and I and me and the rest of the world, I've been talking about this since the early 90s, when we saw disparities in coverage, particularly around queer people of color
Mm-hmm.
and victimized, whether it was a hate crime or discrimination. And I worked on the Matthew Shepard murder. I flew to
Mm-hmm.
Mhm,
Laramie, and
mhm.
that got unprecedented coverage. It was a watershed. My hope and prayer was that it would open the door for people understanding just how prevalent hate crimes are in the queer community, and it did some. But I was also in Newark in the aftermath of Sakia's murder and fought like hell to try and get media coverage and was not anywhere near successful. And 20 years later, we're still working, for visibility. And I think there are two parts here. One is that there just is bias in the media. That they see Matthew Shepard as a college student, white, gay, as I always say, not too gay. Like he was a palatable victim. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah.
And you don't see a butch 15-year-old black lesbian from Newark as the girl next door, right? You saw Matt as the boy next door.
Well,
The
also depending on what you're next door.
I
Because
mean,
she was the girl next door for some people,
for
but
some people, right? I mean, I feel much more aligned with Zakia than I ever have with any other of these horrific incidents that we've tried to sort of amplify and elevate. But the other part of this that is really important is that we also need the queer community to rise up. The media is not going to cover something unless something's happening. Like I always say to people, they call it news for a reason. It's new. So when that murder, I mean, it was horrifying to read.
yeah. Yeah.
And yet, it's not like there was nothing happening in between Matt and then Sakia and then Sam. There are literally hundreds of hate crimes every day on my social media feed, on listservs from other activists. I'm hearing about these things. And folks, if they don't organize within the community to amplify this to the level where the media is going to cover it, then that's part of why we haven't seen the coverage. I mean, so it's a combination of the media not being as proactive or interested or intrinsically, yes, the bias that is there against women, people of color, indigenous folks, queer people who don't fit a certain heteronormative role, right? Or a gender binary, a gender conforming binary. And that's those two pieces together have been a huge challenge. So, when Matthew Shepard was killed, there were vigils, hundreds of vigils all over the country and actually the world. When Sakia Gunn was killed, you and I both know this,
Hmm.
we could not get folks to take the PATH train from New York City to Newark for a vigil. Thousands
A
of
20
people were in
minute
the
ride
street.
at best.
I take it all the time when I go to Hoboken. I take the PATH
Mhm.
train. I was just livid and really even more so just hurt by the fact that like literally 10,000 people got in the street for Matt Shepard and we could not get more than me and a few people from the Anti-Violence Project, on the PATH train to go to Newark for the rallies and protests and vigils and frankly the funeral of Sakia Gunn. There were thousands of kids there. They were all local kids. And that frustration continues. So with with the murder of Sam Nordquist, absolutely horrifying. People are paying more attention. I mean, Black trans women are being killed on literally on almost daily basis, and the media's not covering it. It's an epidemic, and people are not covering it. But there have been dozens of vigils. There was a big one in New York City. I mean, the community has come along some. The media is not coming along with it. So there were vigils in Jersey, in New York, all over the country for Sam, but the media didn't cover them. So for me, this is increasingly becoming the media issue. The media is the problem because our community has worked to make some progress. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the disparities are about a media that does not want to understand the queer community as a diverse community, the intersectional nature of our identities, the fact that, as I've said for like literally 30 years, our community is a microcosm of the larger culture. We are every race, we are every color, we are every ethnicity, we are every immigration status, we have folks of all abilities, all ages. So, but there is still such bias within media around how they tell our stories. Gotten better in some areas, but I agree, hate crimes is a place where it's really become, glaringly obvious that we have to continue to, take this on ourselves. There are a few bloggers, there are queer media, more folks are talking about these things, but the mainstream is still nowhere near where they need to be.
Or financially, if these, major companies don't feel like there's, in their mind, like they're going for a more broader, spectrum. This way they don't have to get that, you know what I mean? Like, it's like they don't want to turn off, in their mind, they start saying, we don't want to turn off our audience. My problem is just,
that is a thing.
Look, we see it happening with, companies dropping DEI, initiatives, and they're dropping. So if the thing comes down to how long do you continue to keep pushing these companies to change when you realize they're probably never really going to change enough for us, and we have to change it ourselves. And not that we stop pushing against them, Cathy, right? Like, we still have to push, but that's what you're saying right now is like by doing the podcast and doing, being news influencers and all these things, it sort of helps level that field.
It does some. At the end of the day, though, I mean, especially from my perspective, the idea of sort of mass education of the larger culture that really knows nothing, that says they don't know a trans person, they might know and understand at least a little bit more of a trans person's experience and our community if they saw coverage of what happened to Sam, if they saw coverage of what happened to Sakia. Like, it's a really vicious cycle. And, I was thinking about the DEI thing when we were talking just now as well. It came to me, like, we're seeing companies that have supported our community for decades walking away. I am really anxious about what Pride's going to look like, not just because of the fact that we need to be in the streets and more political and protesting, because we're already doing that. Pride's only going to be that, magnified. But the fact that so many companies, Target, Google, that supported these events that are really important. They're not just parties. They are opportunities for visibility for the full breadth and diversity of our community. They're going to be left with a lot fewer resources this year.
But one thing I do want to say, Cathy, like, I noticed through the years, there have been some people within the queer community who've been critical that Pride became so corporate, that it became too corporate. Has that, in a way, does this kind of flush out really for us who's really sticking with us and who doesn't? Like, finding out who's really got your back.
That whole rubber hits the road thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've seen Marsha P. Johnson is the reason for the season.
Right. Actually, my favorite sign at the protest a couple weeks ago was, "Those bricks aren't going to throw themselves." But look, I've been on all sides of this. I mean, I worked with New York City Pride for World Pride, which was gigantic. It was 5 million people. It was the largest thing ever. And one of the big issues people can disagree. I mean, it's the queer community. We disagree on lots of things, but the conversation around what the role that businesses and corporations play in the movement, how much influence they have. For me, it's not just, I mean, for them, the businesses, it's about money, right? At the end of the day, like, yes, they want to also, when the wind is blowing the right way, be inclusive, treat their employees right. They're businesses. For me, I I think one of the real losses is not just that, it's the loss that when we were fighting for marriage equality, it was the business community that got behind and helped make that happen. Ironically, many of the same people that are now running away from us. They were signing on to amicus
Mm-hmm.
brief, and
Mm-hmm.
they were providing support to organizations fighting for marriage equality. This was after internally employee resource groups fought for domestic partner rights. So it was all so to have this now, this incredible like reversal come at us is really it's very eye-opening. It's giving a lot of people pause and making a lot of people really think about the role that capitalism has played in movements, right? Um, and it's also making us really think about, like you said, like who our real friends are. My heart is broken for a lot of folks that I know who are really good people and advocates within their companies that are working at companies that are now, you know, walking away. Target. I mean, they already were a mess last year after the election. They're pulling DEI, they're pulling any sponsorship or support of any of the Pride work. We'll see if they're, the Pride section at Target's going to be either that big or non-existent this year. Like, and what they don't understand, and I've literally talked to their marketing folks about this, like, it's not just about the product for us. Like, we get it. We know you're a business. We know you want us to buy stuff and make money. But think about the kids, the queer kids and adults that walk into a Target in a place that's not friendly to us. I'm not going to geographically profile anybody,
Hmm.
but Texas, for example, where my daughter lives, you know, she and her friends walk into a Target and they see that, and she's queer and she's got supportive parents, obviously. Um, her friends don't, and when they see that, they feel seen. So trying to help them understand that this is actually about more than just the bottom line,
Mm-hmm.
it was working, and now it feels like they've just abandoned it, and that's a message that's something we're going to have to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
Well, speaking of messages to unpack, our final headline came to us from the independent news outlet, as we've been discussing independent news. Hellgate recently broke that the story that PBS removed its LGBTQ plus teaching resources and a series of history videos that were created with New York City's Department of Education for public schools. Now, a spokesperson confirmed that the videos were in fact removed because of President Trump's executive orders, though they didn't say which one. Although either likely threatening school funding over gender identity. That's been something that the Trump administration has put forward. Or, of course, the targeting, as we just discussed, of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So, anyway, first and foremost, since then, Chalkbeat, another independent outlet, has reported that the city's Department of Education has posted the videos on their own platform, keeping them available to teachers and students. But again, we have this, and uh, for full disclosure, Dominic and I did work for a member station, but we do have this, this organization that is known for uh, teaching and for teaching marginalized communities pulling back and saying, actually, you know what? No, we're not. Like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's heartbreaking. I mean, I remember even during the Bush years, if it was a debate, it was a debate about funding, it was a debate about diversity and inclusion. I testified for CPB, went back in the day, and it's hard because it was one of our beacons. Like we knew we could always go to PBS and we could expect better. Actually worked on that resource, and this is where public dollars go. Like it's called public broadcasting for a reason, right? It's owned by us. And this sort of anticipatory obedience is really, really disturbing. And that's what this is. It's folks who are in advance thinking, oh, well, this is coming down the pike. These things are being challenged in court. We are fighting the slow rolling coup that they're trying to push out of DC. So to see some big corporations do it, it feels bad enough. To see it come from a place like PBS or CPB or places where, especially for our community, it felt like one of the few that was invested for all the right reasons
Hmm.
It's hard. And these are resources that are not just, they're not just movies and books and websites. These are lifelines for people, especially when you're talking about a curriculum, when you're talking about students. We have to fight long and hard to get the crumbs that we have. So to feel like the one that we're losing these is really, really terrifying. Because, I mean, it goes back to what Dominic said at the beginning. The erasure of our history, we're preserving it now. We are preserving websites. I mean, even way before, right after the election, before the inauguration, there were major projects going on to go to the agency websites by internal folks and external, to start archiving and saving queer content that was on these websites, because we knew it was going to disappear. We were not we it was that whole shocked but not surprised. We were not surprised at all that this stuff started to disappear. I think it really hits. It lands hard when it's PBS, because we want folks to be fighting and to be holdouts, and that was one of the ones that we thought would be. So,
Because I think it comes back to like we were talking before about the Washington Post and certain other media who we believed, you have all this trust in. And I think, and other news outlets that have also, I think, walked back on certain aspects. And I think the feeling sometimes for the people is, we said this before, it's capitalism, it's business. People are looking at this from a certain perspective. I think what I'm curious, just like, about preserving the websites, about doing these things that will preserve our own history. It's like you start to see like there's got to be more of a of a connection that people are making to preserve
mhm.
our own history. Not saying that we give up on anything, but obviously realizing that business maybe just means we can't rely on these resources anymore to be part of our voice. We assume they're allies, but maybe that's the thing that we're learning is, you know, they're allies until it starts costing them money.
I mean, fair weather friends. I mean, it's just, it's the definition. And that's, for those of us who've been in the trenches for decades trying to do this, it's heartbreaking, but at the end of the day, we're not going to forget. We're going to
Right.
remember who our real friends are.
Yeah.
And, it, it really is difficult. I mean, every single day, I feel like I wake up and I think of another thing. I had a conversation with Ben Garcia, who runs the LGBT Museum. It's a project in New
Mhm.
York City. They partner with the New York Public Library and the New York Historical Society, and they're planning on opening an actual physical site. And
Oh,
in 2027, who knows if that's going to happen now? Because I bet some of their corporate sponsors may have been Google and Target and some of the other folks that. I mean, I was inside the Stonewall Visitor Center, which is completely separate from any government entity. So it's there. It's not going anywhere. But Google was one of their sponsors. It's one of their founding corporate sponsors. They got a gold shovel in there and everything. And this is where I wake up and I think, what about all of the queer artifacts at the Smithsonian? Because there are a lot of them. We've been donating and giving stuff. Judy and Dennis Shepard donated a ton of Matthew's personal effects before he was interred in the National Cathedral. They have stuff from the very first Pride in 1970. Like, that was the conversation I had with Ben. Was like, their organization is so much more important now, because they're a place where things will actually be safe. So, like, I have stuff that I want to donate. I'm donating to them. My
Um,
historical artifacts and ephemera going to them now. But the more you see the cumulative effects of all this, it's just really, it's overwhelming. And we're just going to be constantly vigilant for now. But those are the these are the you start pulling these pieces together. It's really and the media is not covering it. Like, this is where, again, like,
well, this is the first time I've heard of it. So,
yeah.
yeah.
oh yeah, I know, but that's the thing. Like, and there's so many things happening. Like, they're creating chaos. We all
Yeah.
know. But some of us are paying a lot more attention and picking these things out and communicating them to you and communicating them to everybody else who listened to me. Like, that's what we're doing, and that's what we're going to be doing for the foreseeable future.
Last question, Cathy,
Yeah.
just to get this, not to end on a downer, but is there any media outlet or any journalist that you've seen that you love the work that they're doing, that you feel in terms of when we're talking about telling these stories of queer, the queer community?
You mean mainstream?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that would be a harder one to
You could,
answer.
and you,
How about you can
well,
name
you could,
independent?
yeah, independent too. It
No,
could
I
be
mean,
on,
sure, independent and queer media is the place where folks are going. I mean, I used to watch Joy Reid, and guess what? We don't get to do
Oh
that
yeah,
hmm
today.
no.
hmm
I mean, that's really MSNBC. It broke my heart last week. I'm glad Jonathan Capehart's going to have some more time on Saturday morning, but let's be honest about where the eyeballs are. Um, it was really heartbreaking. Joy was a champion for us and a truth teller, and incredibly inclusive and intersectional in her storytelling, and her news, her journalism, and that was one of the places I'd go was MSNBC sometimes, not in the morning, but in the
yeah,
evening.
Yeah.
Um,
yeah.
and it's like I feel like wait and see with some of
hmm
the mainstream. The Washington Post used to be my alternative to the New York Times, uh, and now that's not the case. So it's almost like on a weekly basis, I'm losing my legacy media.
All right. Well, that's not quite the non-downer note, but still honest, honest and authentic. And I think
That's
that
right.
Yes,
is really what people are hungry for right now, honesty and authenticity.
That's right.
exactly.
So, Cathy, thank you for always being an honest and authentic voice, just in general, but definitely for the advocacy work that you've done for decades, the tireless work. Thank you, and thank you for joining us. This
Thank you,
has been
Kath. Thank
great.
you, Kathy.
Recently, we aired an interview with content creator Viktoria Capek. She talked about her time as a reporter and anchor, including the unspoken rules of the industry, especially the broadcast dress code that puts unfair expectations onto women.
Today, we're bringing you part two of that conversation where Victoria discusses LGBTQ plus representation in journalism. I started by asking Victoria about navigating her queer identity in the news industry and whether she was able to be open about this part of herself during her time on air.
Yeah. So I never formally on television had an opportunity to say anything along the lines of my queerness, my partner. I actually never had that opportunity. So whenever I get to see a reporter talking about their partner at home or doing something on air, I really do have this immense amount of jealousy. Even if the opportunity did come up, I honestly, even to this day, I don't know if I would have had the bravery to be able to do it. Because for whatever reason, that one feels like a different beast altogether. That aside, though, off of the television cameras, I made my formal debut as Arkansas's queer anchor in June of 2020. That was when I really found TikTok. And what I did was I made a TikTok video actually stitching Megan Mitchell. So, Megan Mitchell is another queer reporter in the industry who, at the time, wow, surprising, we both had the same blonde bob. And I saw a video of her and I was like, oh my God, I look a lot like her. Wouldn't it be crazy if I remade this exact video that she made? Because I have the same outfit, I have the same hair, almost like that's something that we all have in common. And so I stitched this video of her on TikTok where I was able to come out and say like, hey, I'm a queer news anchor as well. And people loved it. They loved, oh my God, not one, but two queer news anchors. This is fantastic. But even better because I was based in Arkansas, which was like kind of an unheard of situation, right? Obviously, there have been queer people who have held leadership roles before, but to be in this state, with so many like anti-LGBT and trans legislation and laws coming out in the past few years, and to have someone be such a visible face of that, it was really, really cool to people. So that was in June of 2020. And I kind of took on this like behind the physical news camera role of being TikTok's Arkansas LGBT news anchor. And it was a really good experience, until, of course, we talked about getting banned from TikTok and at my station and everything like that. But at the time, it was a really good experience. It made me feel like I was in the right place, even when I didn't feel like I was necessarily in the right career or in the right body presentation at the time, because I could see the impact I was making. I remember distinctly having this one email, and this was actually during Tattoo Gate, but I had this email that came from a mother who sent me this really nice message saying, "Dear Viktoria, my daughter is a teenager, and she has recently come out as queer to me. And her and I both watch you on TikTok, and we're here in Arkansas, and now we watch you on the news together. And watching your journey and your honesty on TikTok of coming out and talking about your experience working as an LGBT anchor, it has opened up conversations between us that we would have never had before." And she straight up was just like, "Thank you for being the representation that I never thought my queer daughter would be able to have in our state."
Wow.
That is the email that says it all. That is the message that says it all. I would do all of it over again just to know the impact that had when I did come out. Even though I was scared and I was stressed because I wasn't fully able to embrace this queer identity for about a year and a half more under that contract, I knew behind the scenes I was moving mountains, and it did so much for my own embracing of my queer identity, and I think it did a lot for the community here too. So it was a really special experience.
I and honestly, Rob, the question I'm about to ask you, if you don't feel comfortable answering, that's totally fine. But I did want to say, like, I know for me, like, I experienced, sort of casual homophobia in the newsroom, especially in the control room at times, where people would, throughout my career, especially earlier on. And it's difficult when you're somebody who is in that situation, because you can sometimes not really know how to react. You feel like you don't have a voice. It's like you have a voice that people know sometimes who you are, but you don't feel like you have a voice at the actual table to say, "Hey, listen, I need to," like, that's wrong, because you feel like then you get targeted as being sensitive or whatever. I'm just curious for you, have you ever experienced any kind of casual, whether microaggression or homophobia within the newsroom or the news world yourself?
I'm thinking, the closest I think that would come to it would have just been the insistence on just wearing the dresses and looking the look. I would get called into my news director's office if I cut my hair a little too short. I seriously, I remember one morning I got called in. I had just gotten my hair cut, and it was like slightly less bobby than the regular bob. I was up to my ears, and it was the shortest my hair had been ever since. It still was a little blonde bob. Like, I still looked the part, but like, my news director called me in and just said, "Hey, you got your hair cut." And I was like, "Yeah, don't you love it?" I was so excited about it. And he just said, I hope it grows back fast, or it better grow back fast. Like,
Oh
a
my
threat.
God.
First of all, like, I'm sorry. First of all, I can't control that, buddy. Second of all, like, what the hell? Yes, that might have been just a contract thing. That might have been what you just wanted the women to look like on air. But although it might not have been rooted in homophobia, I expressed many, many times how I wanted to wear suits. I would talk about, or I would attempt to wear some kind of blazer in my attempt to, like, find my style. They call them baby gays when you first come out. And there's a lot of, like, joking online about how, like, oh dear Lord, my style when I was a baby gay was just like such a mess. And I was like trying to navigate the baby gay news anchor style in front of thousands of people. So yes, sometimes I wore a blazer that looked a little bit too big on me, but I never looked bad. However, that would always be the time when someone would make some kind of slight comment about it just looks a little frumpy, or like you look so much better when you wear a dress that like ties here, or you look so good. Like getting called into the office once again, just for someone to say on a day where I was wearing this like blue polka dot dress, I literally looked like a 1940s housewife waiting for her husband to return from war. I remember this day because I had just gotten my hair re-bleached and I had curled it. I looked extra pretty, got called into that same office, that same news director, and he said, you know, girl, you've been looking really good. You actually look like you've lost a lot of weight. Stuff like that.
My God.
That shit hurts and it like sticks with you. So do I think it was rooted in homophobia? The naivety in me and the optimist in me wants to say no, because I think it just happens to women across the board in this industry. But in my little gay brain, they did coincide, and it really impacted. I'm really traumatized by the industry, frankly, because of things like that. Yeah.
Jenna?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I'm wondering, and as a non-queer member of this conversation, I guess. So tell me if I'm out of line or something, but has the presence of someone like a Rachel Maddow made a difference? Because she's been very openly queer. She totally rocks a blazer, very little makeup. She's not glammed within an inch of her life. And I'm wondering if not only her presence, but her popularity. It's not like, she's on the air, but no, people don't like it. She has an audience. So has that made any kind of a difference?
I think that's a good question. I might have the unpopular opinion in this situation, but I think it also might have to do with some critiques I have of the industry as a whole. I think, I've posted these videos on TikTok talking about, like there's not a lot of people that look like me, and people always come back with Rachel Maddow as an example, and Jana Shortle, who works for I think Care 11 in Minneapolis. And those are two wonderful examples of these queer members, queer individuals who, like you said, they have the short hair, they look the part. So yes, I think that does offer representation to the look, but it doesn't necessarily offer the thing I said earlier. It's not necessarily about just having a seat at the table. It's about having the voice. And to me, Rachel Maddow is still sipping the journalism Kool-Aid, if you will. She's still drinking the same juice that all these news anchors are drinking, because the industry damns you so much from being able to show or express I guess I have to say opinions. I know people don't think that those words mix, but like as human beings, we all have opinions, we all have experiences. And because she's not able to really express her queer experiences, I don't think it's necessarily doing as much for the queer community as it could be doing if she was able to use the power of her queer experience and her look as a queer person in that position to better enhance her storytelling. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense.
So that is kind of, it is, again, it's doing a lot. It is progress because people get to see someone who might look a little bit more like them. And I respect the hell out of that. And I love that for the 16-year-old who cuts off all their hair, who is like, this person is very pretty, and they have short hair and they wear jackets and not dresses. I am also very pretty as well. That means so, so much. To me personally, however, I think that they're not necessarily representing the queer community in as vocal a way as I wish they could be. But that is just the industry, and you can't blame her for coming in and doing her job.
Totally.
It's so tough. I think we want so much of this change to happen right now, to be at the place where we're all at personally. And when you're dealing with these big corporations, they are that. They are big corporations that have certain, and so it kind of, the change at these places sometimes is so slow. But I think of course, like you said, it's I guess it's something there, but we have to want more representation and more stories. It's like this whole idea of having, I guess, and we've discussed this before, off when we were doing a pre-interview actually, where we talked about not just having stories for, let's say, queer, it's Pride Month. And then that's when you see all the stories. It's like wanting to have a representation throughout the year because we exist, correct? I mean, that's the
Yes.
other thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, you and I, Dominic, like we don't go away after Pride Month. Like our
Right.
like we don't poof disappear, exactly that. Like our stories and our experiences continue beyond that. And even though we are seeing progress in these news stations celebrating Pride and covering more queer stories throughout Pride Month, again, that's wonderful. But it's like damning LGBT legislation is happening throughout the country constantly. It's not just impacting us during Pride Month. Imagine what would happen if you didn't just talk about the legislation, but you talked about the people who that legislation was impacting. And that would be queer individuals, that would be people of color, that would be minorities. And I still think the industry is so far from that because for whatever reason, I don't know why.
Well, yeah. So one of the other things, because we have discussed a lot of, there's a lot that needs to change. I think a lot of people would agree with that, audience members included. But what are some of the positives for you? Because there's got to be something that keeps you in this business. Like I know for me, even though with the layoff and everything, and people being like, "Oh, well, just do something else," and I was like, "No, I literally love this." So, what is it about this work that keeps you going?
Great question. And thank you for saying, let's stay positive, because I literally told you guys during our pre-interview, I was like, oh my God, I don't just want to be like a spiral of negativity. I promise to everyone listening at home, I'm a pretty joy. I am literally leading a workshop on following your joy. It just so happens that this industry was a bit traumatic. That said, Jenna, you get it. Like if you are a journalist, if you are a reporter, print, television, otherwise, it's in your bones, man. It is in your blood. If you're on the producing side, it is still something that I wake up every morning and I miss it every single day. Because the impact that you can have if you filter out all the noise is incredible, because you and not only from like the reporter side of things, like I got to have a backdoor view into every person's life, people from all walks of life, which, me being a white middle class person from Georgia, like I might not necessarily would have had the experiences of learning about the indigenous communities in northern Minnesota and getting to like go on their reservation and see their stories and tell their stories and hear and learn about them and the impacts that certain things are having in their life is an experience that I would not give up for the world. So there was a lot of positive because you got to learn a lot. You got to be a forever student. You also got to just help make these people feel heard when they got to share their stories, when they got to tell you. More often than not, people were so excited to talk about rice farming, right? Like they're so excited, but then they're devastated when there are floods happening in southern Arkansas and their rice fields are flooded. What are we going to do? How are we going to feed our families? And that's devastating, but it also is an amazing opportunity for them to really express to the world how important this is to them, how important their lives are, and we have a chance to get to see it. That's the part of it that I love is the learning and the storytelling and the getting to tell other people's to connect the world, I guess. And so I say I miss it every single day, and I do. I work in PR now, and it just doesn't give the same thrill. And so it's so it is hard to sit here and say, I feel like I was essentially almost phased out of the industry because of the way I look and the way I wanted to express myself, when at the same time I feel this like passion in my blood to be able to tell stories, and to connect the world in this way. So there is a lot of positive that comes with it. It's also just like a really fun job. You get to wake up and you never know what's going to happen that day. You never know what
Absolutely.
stories are going to happen, and it keeps you on your toes. And there's a lot of really exciting parts about it. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to say too, though, that you're doing great work on your TikTok channel. I think you put great content out there that is talking about something that, you know, being able to talk about this part of the industry, it's complicated, and I think being able to put it out there in a way that people can sort of get a little bit of behind the scenes of what it's like, because I think so many times people just think this is like, you guys have the best job, and there is a great part of the job, there really is,
Yeah.
but there's also a part that it is a business, and can be really tough on the people who work in it. And I think you do a great job, though, of being positive on there too. And I know you're doing a lot. So thank you for doing that and for creating that. I guess the last question we want to ask you, though, is uh, we ask all our guests is about, how did you become a journalist? What led you to this field?
So I was a theater kid growing up. I know nothing about me gives that away at all, that I was a theater kid all growing up. Um, I've always loved telling stories. I've also always been a really good student. Like, I love learning. I would go back to school for the rest of my life if I could. I would go get 1,000 degrees. I literally would go learn anything in the world, because I think it's just important. It's fun. Um, but when it came to theater and it came to storytelling, I actually went to school, for none of those things. I went to school to study forensics, forensic science, because I had big ambitions for whatever reason of being the head of the FBI one day. Um, yeah, yep,
That's
yep. And
impressive.
that was very ambitious of me. I sat down in a few, so I had to take the criminal justice law classes and whatnot. And one of my classes was um, a police writing class, where you had to learn how to take reports like a police officer. And first of all, didn't like that at all. But I'm so grateful I had a professor, Tim Hayes, who literally pulled me up to class one day and he was just like, "What are you doing here?" He's like, "What? You are too gifted of a writer and just as a person." Because he was like, what are you doing in this class? What do you want to do?" And I was just like, "Oh, head of the FBI, whatever." And he was like, "This is not what you need to be doing. Like, you need to go do something where you can connect with other people." And so I told him, I was like, "Well, I always wanted to do theater." He was like, "What? Go do that." And I was like, "But I was told all growing up that theater isn't a viable job because you're never going to make money, right? Being an actor, being in that career, doing whatever, the thing that they tell kids, which is so damning to their dreaming and their entire existence." And so he was like, "Then go find another way to do what theater does for you." And so I sat down and I thought about it and I was just like, okay, theater, what do I love about it? I love the thrill of getting to perform. Yes, yes, I love the thrill of getting to do that. But I loved more than ever the community I was able to build from theater. And I loved the stories that not only came from that community, but the stories we were able to tell together. And basically, I went through this whole like 19-year-old like meltdown crisis. And through that, I was able to figure out like, oh, so broadcast journalism is something where I kind of get all of these pieces a little bit. So I started looking, I was like, okay, well, first of all, yes, there's the like performer aspect of it. I can get up in front of a camera. Like, I'm confident enough to do that. But that is where I very quickly was able to figure out like, oh my God, this is storytelling. Once I actually learned what it was, because I don't think I understood really what journalism was when I was 19 years old until I started taking these classes. And I was like, oh my God, this is storytelling. Like I get to do the exact same thing I got to do in theater, but instead of telling a fictional story, like I get to get up and like help tell real people's stories. So I ran headfirst into this field after I figured out like this gives me the fulfillment that I loved being a kid in theater growing up. But like I get to tell people stories and I get to connect with literally the entire world. That whole idea I was telling you about getting a backdoor view into people's lives, like the thrill that that gave me was, I mean, like what a rush. And that's how I ended up in journalism is it ended up being my little spin-off series from doing theater. And I'm so glad. I've never been so happy that something didn't work out the way I thought I would have wanted it to as a kid. Because what this has brought me, the curiosity that this field has brought me, the passion that this field has brought me is something that I don't think any other field can bring you in the same way that journalism does. So that's how I found it. And that's kind of the relationship I have with it today.
Well, thank you for being it. And you obviously you have the skills for it. You really do. You're amazing. You're a great storyteller. And you know what? The industry's it is changing. And hopefully, it continues to grow and change as we go along. So thank you for joining us, Viktoria. It's really been a great conversation. And hope to see you again soon.
I would love to see you guys again soon. Thank you so much. And thank you for what you're doing and getting our stories out there as well. I appreciate you guys and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.